Okay, greetings everyone. My name is Donna Aufdenberg, and tonight I will be talking about planting the garden. This is something I find that is essential for a successful garden. It's one of those things that I think that a lot of gardeners neglect on the front end. And in a year like this where everybody's wanting to garden, I think it's a great topic to start out with during the garden season. So first off, you might ask yourself, why do you want to garden? There's a lot of reasons out there. A lot of people have different reasons. Personal satisfaction is one reason. It's gardening happens to be one of the #1 hobbies. A lot of relaxation. You can have high quality fresh vegetables, especially compared to what you can find in the groceries. The economics, you can really save on the grocery bill. Produce availability, you might not be able to find certain things in the store, such as kohlrabi, and you might have a want to grow it, so it's something that you will be able to have. You enjoy being out there with your family. It's a great opportunity to spend time with the kids. One important thing that a lot of people look at is how to control how their crops are growing. Instead of going to the grocery store and just picking up anything that could have had anything sprayed on it, you have more control over what you spray on your own produce. And so you have a choice of not spraying, having reduced spray, or going with conventional methods. So that is a big reason why a lot of people like to grow their own produce. And of course, then you have an opportunity to share the harvest with family and friends. So what makes a good garden site? Well, there's a lot of different things, a lot of different opinions out there of what makes a good garden site. These are what I say makes a good garden site. Well, #1 is it's fairly level, or it can have a little bit of a slope to it. Another big thing is full sun, meaning 6 to 8 hours of sun or more. Good soil composition. You don't want it too clay, too sandy. You want it, not too compacted. And they'll talk about that in our next session. Good drainage, definitely. You don't want an area where water collects and things drowned. You want it close to a water source. Definitely, because here in Missouri, we're bound to get a 6 to 8 week drought, and sometimes even longer. And in those cases, you will want to water. The other thing that we worry about is proximity to trees, buildings, and shrubs. If you get them too close to trees, trees can really compete with the vegetables, pull a lot of nutrients, a lot of water out of the ground, and will deplete your vegetable plants. In terms of buildings, you're talking about shading. So we really need to try to get them out in the open. Once again, that 6 to 8 hours of sun. Another thing is having it close to home. I know there's a lot of gardeners out there that will have the garden in one spot and live in another. Well, a lot of times that will lead to disaster. I always try to say out of sight is out of mind. Put that garden where you're going to be walking by it every day, that you can keep an eye on what's going on in there. And then the last one is no walnut trees anywhere near. Walnuts and gardens do not go hand in hand, and a lot of that has to do with the walnuts putting out a toxin into the ground that negatively affects the garden plants. On site preparation, you might think, okay, what do I do first? There's a lot of opinions out there. If people ask me, I always tell them soil testing. That's the first thing you need to do. That's the best thing you can do. And once again, they'll be talking about that on the next session. Weed control, whether you take care of the weeds before you till or after the till, but you have a plan. You need to have a plan on how you're going to get those weeds out. Then you might go and work the soil. Then comes the amending the soil, where you're going to be adding lime or manure or any number of components. And then also think about that composting. If you can get some compost, it always is beneficial to try to get that added into soil. So really all these things you could mix or match on trying to get whichever one you want to go first. But definitely, I think the soil testing might be the best, putting it at the first. The other thing that you might take a look at is garden equipment. I know there's lots of people out there that just have a rake and a shovel and a hoe, and that's it. These are mine. At my house, I sort of have a lot of things, things that are more comfort, like the little green stool that's on wheels and you can roll it down back and forth down the row. I have a little planter that makes planting very easy. A wagon, so you don't have to have all these items, but the basics is important. There's no right or wrong reason on garden tools, just so that you have something that you can dig holes with, hoe the weeds out, and rake the ground smooth. And there's a lot of people out there that don't even have a tiller. They do no-till gardening, and basically they're just taking and digging a hole, mending that hole, and planting in it. So, I mean, there's just a lot of ways to garden. And this just happens to be more of the traditional way. Just more of an up-close thing. I really like wearing gloves, having hand tools close by. Watering cans, I really think are a necessity when it comes to planting transplants. Just anything that makes your life a lot easier when it comes to gardening. The lower right picture is more of a close-up of different things that you can have. My tools aren't fancy. Some of them are old and rusty, but they work, and that's the big thing. I know there's a lot of people that go to junk stores and thrift stores, and sometimes you can find some older tools there if you need to be saving a little bit of money. On determining, let's see. Okay. On determining the size of your garden, think about the space available, the time available, your family size. Think about, you need to think about the fact that you need about 100 to 200 square feet per person. And that depends on fresh eating, freezing, and canning. The fresh eating, if that's all you're going to do, you could probably do the 100 square feet per person. If you're going to be doing more of the canning and stocking away, that's when we start talking about the upper limits of 200 square feet per person. And think about how much do you really want to plant. That's one thing. We can really overdo it, but then on the other end, you might get halfway through the garden season and go, why didn't I plant more? So really start to think about what you want to plant and how much you want to plant, and that will help you determine your garden size. And then think about if you want to plant some additional rows. We're really pushing planting a row for the hungry or elderly neighbors or family and friends. That way we can share the crops. We talked about amending the soil a little bit a while ago. I want to talk a little more about that, even though we're going to cover it on that next session. Soil test first. That is first and foremost. Any type of amending the soil, adding lime, manures, fertilizer, anything like that, you want to base it on a soil test. And that's why we encourage it. You wouldn't go to the doctor and try to tell him what you need, and based on what you think, you want to base it on what he thinks you need, or blood tests or things like that. So I like to equate that, so always be prepared to get that soil test and base any amendments on that soil test. The other thing I like to really promote is adding organic matter. Organic matter is anything like leaves or grass clippings, vegetable scraps from the house, anything out of the compost pile, manure, anything like that. Just keep in mind that always improves the garden. So the more you can add, the better off you are. Just remember that with any garden problem or soil problem, organic matter really solves the problem. So if you have soil crusting problems with your seedlings, and we'll talk a little bit about that later, add more organic matter. If you have a heavy clay, add more organic matter. Heavy sand, add organic matter. Your garden is just growing poorly. You know, that's where it goes back to getting that soil test, and I bet you that you'll have to add organic matter. So there's just lots of different ways to add it, and then once again, they will talk about this on the second session. When we talk about amending the soil and cultivating the soil, just remember that tillers are great, but they can also be not so great. I personally own 4 tillers. Yes, I said 4 tillers. And this just happens to be 3 of them. And I put this up here because there are several different kinds out there. In the back, you can see there's a rear tine. It's the largest. The front on the right is a front tine, and on the left is a cultivator. And so each of these have different good things about them, and they both all have bad things about them. The rear tine, it does a good job of cultivating, but almost to the point where it just starts to destroy that organic matter. Remember that word, organic matter? That's important in a garden. And so when we start to cultivating a lot, we can really start to destroy that soil composition. We can bring weed seeds to the surface. We can create a hard pan that keeps roots from growing downward. It just is, sometimes it's not a really good situation. Now, I'm not saying these tillers are bad. They do a good job of cultivating, but overuse of the tillers is what we try to keep people from doing. So if you're using a tiller to get rid of the weeds, stop. Find a different way of getting rid of those weeds. If you're using a tiller to just turn the soil once in the fall and maybe the spring just to get it leveled up so you can plant, that's the correct way to use one. Or mid-season when you need to replant a new crop, then you can pull it out then also. The front tine is not as bad at destroying the organic matter. It's not going to cultivate as deep either, although you can still set it pretty deep. But if I had to do over again, I would definitely spend the money on a front tine versus the rear tine. And then, of course, we have the cultivator. I like the cultivator because you can get into smaller areas, you can get in raised beds with it, and you don't go as deep. It doesn't tend to destroy that soil composition as bad, but it is smaller, so it's not going to do those big heavy duty jobs. Now when we talk about pricing, the cultivator is going to run about $275 probably to $350, whereas the others will run up to $800 or $900. So really there's a big difference in price also. But once again, if you're tilling, till just a few times a year. Try not to over-till. Learn how to use a tiller right. That's the big thing if you're going to invest in one. Determining what you want to grow. I know we talked about the size of the garden, but think about what you want to grow. What does your family like? What is the cost of the vegetables if you purchase them from a store? I mean, if you think about cucumbers and peppers, I think those are always the price points that my eyes sort of bulge on. Sometimes cucumbers can get up to almost to $1 a piece, and then peppers, if you're wanting even a red pepper, you might be paying $2 to $3 a piece. So think about that, because if you grow them, you can grow as many plants as you want, and you're going to reduce the price on some of the produce that you would want. Think about the produce availability in the grocery stores. What grows well in your area, because not everything grows well. We in Missouri, where I'm from, Southeast Missouri, we ramp up real fast on that heat, and so sometimes our radishes don't grow very well. Sometimes we find our spinach bolting real fast. So you really have to think about and maybe ask some people around what grows well in your area. What will I be successful at? Think about the timing and the season. Even though we can't grow radishes in the spring, we can sure grow radishes in the fall. Starting in August, we can go ahead and sow them and get them going, and then we have delicious radishes that are 10 times better than any spring radish. So think about those things. What grows well, and think about that timing and season. and think about what plants and seed you have available in your area. You may have to look locally versus looking online. And so that might also indicate what you will be growing versus what you will not be growing. Things that we also really like to focus on is that last average spring frost date in the spring, that first average frost date in the fall. And this is a map of Missouri, and as you can see, the dates vary quite a bit. And so pay attention to those dates, because that gauges what we can grow and when we can grow them. And we'll talk about that here in a few minutes. So cool season crops you can plant before the last average frost date. And then the warm season crops, of course, you're going to be planting after that frost date. And so here are the fall ones. And once again, in the fall, this is going to dictate how long your season's going to last. So, you know, a lot of times we get that first killing frost around October 20th, you're going to lose your tomatoes, your peppers, things like that. So that's going to gauge how long your season is. That's going to gauge what you can replant. So fall gardens, we try to really gear them up around August 15th, 20th, and that way you can have quite a bit of frost-free days to have those cool season crops in the fall. Okay, so we talked about early spring vegetables, or I mentioned it, so let's run down some of those that you can plant before that last average frost date. So these are things that you can start planting like in March into April. So beets, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, carrots, cauliflower, kohlrabi, kale, lettuce, mustards, onion, parsnips, peas, potatoes, radishes, spinach, Swiss chard, turnips, rhubarb, and asparagus. So, I mean, there is quite a bit of plants that you can plant just starting in March. Now, some of these you can replant ever so many weeks. You know, right here, we're at May 5th. You can still get maybe some lettuce in. You can still get some spinach in. They may start to get a little bitter. They may start to bolt, but there's still time to get those things in. You know, it's a little late for onions and potatoes, but, you know, there's still some people planting them. And so they might get just smaller potatoes, or they may get onions that just don't keep very well. So just keep in mind that you can still plant some of this stuff. It may not be in the best shape midsummer, but you can still get going. These are warm season vegetables. So these are ones that you definitely want to start planting now. These are ones that we try to encourage people to wait till May 1st. So that way we're well after a frost. And so, and the other thing that we always worry about is ground warmth. So these are the ones that really respond when the ground starts to warm up quite a bit. And so beans, cucumbers, eggplants, any of the melons, okra, peppers, pumpkins, any of your squashes, corn, tomatoes. So any of those things you want to be planting after the frost date. So May 1st is what we really gun for on these. Once again, you can plant a fall garden here in Missouri, and you're looking at planting anywhere between August 1st and August 20th. Now, there are some things that I really think that need to be planted at the end of July, such as your cucumbers, your beans, you know, anything like that that's still a pretty warm season crop. We still want you to start it in July, but then the cool season stuff, you can go ahead and start in August, mid-August. Now, as far as the broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower, things like that, you really need to try to find transplants. So you can't plant seed in August. You have to seed them in latter part of June, first part of July to get plants that can be transplanted into the garden. But the rest of them you can do by seed. When we start getting the shorter days, that's when we try to get varieties that are 70 days to harvest or less. And there's quite a few out there that you can utilize. I think I planted a bean that was a 60-day bean, and it was called Early Serve. And it was a fairly nice bean. I hadn't grown it before, but it's one of those that is a shorter day plant that you can grow in the fall. One excellent tool that MU Extension has is this vegetable planting calendar. This really is a tool that you can use to determine how much produce your family can grow. It gives you planting days. It gives you spacing, anything like that. It's a great guide. And I listed the website there, and we can get it to you later. But as you can see on this front page of the vegetable planting calendar, it tells you approximately how many plants you need or feed a row per person. So you could sit down with this and try to figure out, okay, I need 10 plants if I'm going to feed 2 people, or I need a 50-foot row if I'm going to feed a family of 5. So it gives you a really good way of planning and deciding how much you need of each. Further over to the right, it goes into the distance between plants, the distance between rows. It talks about how deep that the seed needs to go in the soil. And it also talks about the days from planting to harvest. So this is really an all-around guide that is really, really helpful. And this is the second page, and or this gives you a closer up view of the planting details. So the fresh use versus processing. And then, of course, once again, looking over to the right, you get the seed depths and days to harvest. And then on the second page, you get the warm season vegetables. And it's just, like I said, it's just a wonderful guide. After the first 2 pages, it divides Missouri into a north, a mid, and a south, and it gives you planting dates based on the crop. So, for example, this one is beans, and it takes you through all the different kinds of beans, and then it talks about some of the traits or the, just some of the different characteristics of those varieties. And then over to the right, it gives you the planting days. The first column is southern, second is mid, and the third column is the northern dates. And so it gives you a range of dates that you can be planting each of those crops, which is really nice. And it's always, this guide is always my go-to guide, especially when somebody calls in and starts asking questions and, I'm having to fumble through things. Well, this is my go-to guide because it's all right there. Next, I want to talk about planting on paper first. This is a step I think a lot of gardeners skip, and it's really important in my mind. Because the other day I just had an argument with my husband about where did we plant those potatoes last year? And you would think that, our gardening season wasn't that far, back. So I should be able to remember where those potatoes were planted. But he thought they were one place and I thought they were the other. We finally opened up our notebook where we keep all our sketches, and, well, both of us were wrong. And so I really like planting on paper first. Big thing, you can draw out that space, and you can figure out exactly how much space do you need. Then you think about, okay, do I have enough time to take care of what I've just drew out? Then you can write down the side, and this is what I love to do. I write down the side of my piece of paper or my notebook, all the plants that I am going to plant. So I know I'm not leaving anything out when I start drawing. And then I think about the maintenance, the pests, the harvest, and we'll talk about some of this here in a minute. And then, of course, when to plant. How will my planting happen? So putting on paper first really helps you to organize your thoughts and figure out a game plan. And that's what I really like. Several years ago, several colleagues and I put together a garden journal, and this provides that opportunity to draw out the spring garden, the fall garden, and then keep your gardens from year to year on your drawings. It gives you an opportunity in the guide to also think about your garden environment. What is your soil pH? What is, or do you have any microclimates? Does one end of the garden grow better than the other? So it just gives a lot of opportunities to talk about a lot of different topics, successes and failures, things to try. I always want to try yard-long green beans every year. And every year I forget to plant them. And if I would just take that time to fill out this page or that page, I think I could do a better job on remembering to order them and to plant them. And the other thing is it gives you a calendar, an opportunity to write down when those pest problems occur, when those weather problems occur, you know, and that way you have a record, because I can tell you blister beetles are always going to show up right about the same time. Squash bugs, right about the same time. And so if you have a written record of that, then you can keep up from year to year on, oh, I got to get that out, or oh, I got to go buy more of that. So it really makes a difference. Keep it together. You know, that's the other thing that I've learned is keep all your gardening stuff in one spot. And when I say that, it's the notes, it's the books, it's the drawings. You know, whether it's a notebook, you cramming everything in, whether it's a pre-printed journal. I know a lot of people have went to the computer and they do everything on computer. There's a lot of people out there with just lots of different gardening softwares that you can get. But the big thing that goes right back to plan it, get it on paper, and that way you have a record of what you've done and where you're going with it. So when planning your garden, we're going to talk about a little bit here about your gardening styles, the planting dates. We're going to talk about the number of days to harvest, you know, because that's a big one that people forget to think about. Link the harvest time, number of harvests per planting. You know, keep all these in mind because this does make a difference. I know a lot of people go out there and they plant 5 plants of zucchini. So how many plants does your family really need of zucchini that produces like mad? You'll be hanging it on everybody's doorknobs, or sticking it in cars or trying to get rid of it. So just remember, think about how many harvests per planting that you're going to have so that you're not overdoing it and you're not going to wear yourself out and go, oh, I'm never doing this again. And keep in mind, we'll talk about this in a minute, crop rotation, because it does matter. And that's another reason why having a garden journal or just drawing it out makes a big difference, because then you can rotate your crops to keep the diseases to a minimum and the pests to a minimum. And we'll talk about that here in a minute. So on gardening styles, there's lots of different gardening styles out there. We have traditional gardens, you know, the in-ground gardening where we go out, we dig in the ground. Then we have our raised bed gardens, and that's where, you know, you're putting up a form and filling it with soil. Container gardening, succession planting, and edible landscaping. Edible landscaping is becoming the hype gardening type thing. It's the trend, and mainly because a lot of people are reducing the size of their lawns, reducing the size of their living space. And so the only places they have to go is in the landscape. And so there's a lot of things you can be doing, planting a tomato here, a pepper there, a bed of lettuce, you know, so there's just a lot of things that can go into the landscape. Now talking about traditional vegetable gardens, these traditionally can require large areas. Now I know a lot of people that might have 40 or 100 square feet, and they can do a lot with that amount. But then if you're dealing with a family of 4 to 6, that's when we need to start talking about, okay, do you need a 900 to 1,000 square foot garden? And so we have to think about that. How big can we go? The other thing that we do with traditional gardens is we cultivate the soil, whether we're putting it in a tiller, a cultivator, or we're just digging holes and putting plants in. So somehow, some way you're cultivating the soil. You're planting in single rows and usually widely spaced rows. So depending on the crop, it may be an 18-inch row, it may be a 36-inch row, it could be a 60-inch row. And so you're planting in rows with walk spaces. And then of course, with the traditional vegetable garden, you're going to have to find a way to deal with the weeds. So the gardens to the right, they are my gardens here several years ago. The top one is probably second week of May, and so things are growing well. And it might be a little bit later than that. It may be the third week of May, but things are growing well. Now the picture below it is when things are starting to mature out. The potatoes are dying. You know, things are starting to be harvested. The cabbage heads are starting to really look nice. So, you know, this is a traditional garden. So you can see the walkways, you can see the rows. Then we have raised bed gardens. This is more of an intensive gardening style. And I say intensive because you're not having to deal with the walkways. So things are going to be a lot closer and pushed together. And so they're going to be growing sometimes only a matter of inches from each other. Now, materials could range from wood boards, stone blocks, concrete blocks, you know, anything. I have several that are made out of a composite hard plastic that doesn't rot. And so it's my favorite beds because, you know, they're up off the ground, you know, and I can work them easier. And the plastic does not deteriorate. Big thing about these is no wider than 4 or 5 feet. And that's because you want to be able to reach to the middle. They can vary by depth in terms of how deep they are. And they can also vary by length, but we like to try to keep them 4 or 5 feet wide. And that way raised beds are not meant for you to step into. And that's why we try to limit the width. The big issue that I see with the raised beds, well, there's a couple issues. One is finding good soil to go back into them. I know a lot of people have turned to the soilless mixes, you know, where they mix in peat moss and manure, and they mix in just, there's all sorts of formulas out there. But if you're trying to find good soil, you know, call around, find out who has the soil, and go look at it instead of buying it sight unseen, because a lot of what they say is topsoil ends up being a subsoil where somebody's digging a basement or where somebody's doing some groundwork. And so it's a struggle to find some good soil to put back in them. And so what I find most people doing is they will get that soil and they will mix in a lot of compost, a lot of different amendments to try to make it a better soil. But just keep in mind, there's lots of different formulas on how to put soil into these beds. And we have an excellent guide through MU on raised beds. And I can always send that to you, you know, or any hort specialist can send that to you. One nice thing about them is that you can get an earlier starts because they are above ground. They're going to dry out, or they're going to dry out better in the spring. They're going to warm up faster in the spring. But just keep in mind, when we get to midsummer, they're also going to dry out horribly. So you'll find yourself having to water them twice as much. And so just keep that in mind. The other thing that can be a real downfall on them is it's so easy to overplant, so easy to crowd in them. And so you think, okay, you know, I need to plant all my garden. How am I going to fit it all in? And so we tend to overcrowd. So the pictures to the right, the left top is just basically boards that have been used to hold the soil in. They're untreated. Picture on the right is basic decorative stonework, and it works also. And then I included the picture on the bottom because they are deeper beds. So the ones at the top are maybe only 8 to 10 inches deep. The ones at the bottom are more like 18 inches deep. So definitely different. When we talk about raised bed gardening, we also sometimes like to talk about square foot gardening. And basically it's because we like to try to get people to realize you can only plant so much in a square foot. And so 1 tomato per 1 square foot, if it's a determinate. If it's an indeterminate, you may need to do 1 plant per every 2 square feet. And so there's just a lot of different information out there, a lot of different guides on how to do square foot gardening. But most of them are like this. The bigger plants get 1 square foot. The smaller plants, you can plant multiples in. The pictures to the right are from a school project, and we used square foot lattice work to let the kids know that you only plant like 6 carrots or 6 peas, or, you know, I'm just throwing numbers out there. But the picture below is after we've removed the grid and plants are starting to grow, and they do eventually fill up that space. It may look like we've planted sparsely, which we have to a certain degree, but that way all the plants have a good shot of growing. Container gardens seem to be the hype right now, and a lot of that has to do, once again, limited time, limited space. So everybody seems to be wanting to do the container gardens. The big thing is make sure you have a clean pot, make sure they have drainage holes, try to use only potting mixes. And you can amend those with different amendments. The only thing I caution you is don't use regular garden soil. Try to steer away from that because of weed seeds and because of diseases. So, if you're doing big plants like tomatoes, try to do no less than a 5-gallon bucket. I know a lot of people think they can get by with a gallon or two, but tomatoes just really need a lot more than that. So no less than a 5-gallon bucket on size for tomatoes. Big thing on those is when you first start out on the containers, you might only be watering maybe once every other day, once every third day. But by the time we're mid-season, you're going to be really watering them every day, if not, you know, sometimes twice a day, depending on our heat and depending on where it's sitting. And once again, if you're putting vegetables in containers, it is so easy to crowd these plants. And so just take a look at that garden calendar I was talking about and see what that spacing should be. Because you may have to go back and thin, like if you would plant plant lettuce or spinach, carrots, things like that. Definitely you want to take a look at the spacing. And so the top picture on the left is lettuce. Then we have Pro Mix on the right, which that's the version I buy, but I mean, I'm not saying you have to buy it, but it's pretty good for containers. And really anything that says potting mix, that's what you want. Avoid potting soil. You want potting mix. That's what it should say. The picture of the square box, that is made out of 1x4s, and it's what I call salad boxes. And so I'm growing all my salad components in there in very, very early spring. And it does a really good job on mini carrots, lettuce, spinach, and radishes. And then, of course, on the bottom, that's tomatoes in pots. Let's talk a little bit about succession planting. Back in the 50s, 60s, you know, people really tried their best to do succession planting. And I think a lot of that had to do with people needed produce. You know, sometimes it was hard to come by, especially in the rural areas. And what succession planting is planting 2 or more different crops in the same garden space within one growing season. And so today's garden, usually what we do is we plant something and then we're done. And so what we're really trying to do, especially with, you know, in today's times, we're trying to get people to realize you can plant, you know, lettuce, turn around 2 weeks later, plant lettuce, turn around 2 weeks later and plant lettuce. And then, you know, in that way, it gives you a continuous crop of lettuce versus, okay, I only have it for 2 weeks and then it's spoiled, it's done, it's over with. And so, so basically what succession planting is just planting 2 or more different vegetables during the growing season. And the example I have here is that peas, once the peas are taken out and they're done, you're going to be planting cucumbers. And so on this slide, you know, I just gave some examples. So in March, you're going to be planting cabbage. When it's done, you come back in with squash right behind it. And then, of course, when it's done, you can plant lettuce or spinach. Next line would be you've got spinach that would overwintered. Once it starts to bolt and mature, then you come back with beets, and then you can come back with peppers. So basically what you're doing is a cool season, a warm season, and followed by another cool season. But it doesn't have to be this way. It can be lettuce followed by lettuce and then a warm season, or it can be radishes, and then a warm season. So all I'm doing is showing you that you can get more out of your garden if you practice succession planting. And so we're really trying to talk to people and get this back as a gardening technique. Just to give you an example, these are from Johnny's Seeds, a seed company. They have a web page where you can see what can be planted every 7 days, what can be planted every 20 days, and 30 days. And so I think it really helps you to see what the possibilities are. And so you could have multiple plantings of cucumbers. About every 3 weeks, you could be planting cucumbers and have a continuous supply. And a lot of times our cucumbers get downy mildew, they get powdery mildew, they get spider mites, the list goes on and on. And so sometimes we just have to, stop struggling with that vine and start some new ones. And so I think this 21-day interval might be a good, wise idea for continuous cucumber production. But that's just one example. Okay, so when we talk about succession planting, we have to take a look at the days until maturity. And so I just put these all on here for everyone to realize that not everything grows in the same amount of time. So radishes, you can have radishes in 20 to 30 days. But on the other end of things, let's say the cauliflower or let's say the cabbage, you're looking at a long-term vegetable, which leans more towards the 120, 125 days. And so if you're going to practice succession planting, it would make more sense to try to utilize the shorter days until maturity and try to leave the longer days for that mid-season. And so I always thought this was very interesting how the days can differ so much on the crops. So just an example. Okay, so let's talk about determining whether you're going to plant seeds or transplants. There are some vegetables that you can only plant by seeds. Then there's some vegetables that you can only transplant by plants. And so this is good to know. That way, when you go to the store, you won't be looking for corn transplants. However, I have seen them, and I always chuckle. But the corn is something you only want to plant by seed, or at least that's in my opinion. So I'm just threw this in there so you could see. All right, so carrots, I know I have to have seeds, lettuce seeds, peas, only seeds. Whereas your transplants, those are the ones you're going to be either growing yourself from seed indoors, or you're going to be going to the store and buying them. Now, there are some things that you can do either or. So cucumbers, squash, watermelon, cantaloupe, you can plant them in the garden as seeds, or you can start them indoors. And we'll talk about the reason why you might want to here in a minute. And then, of course, we have the tubes, the bulbs, tubers, and slips. Things like leeks, potatoes, onion sets, onion slips, and sweet potatoes. So once you determine what you need by seed or by transplant, that's when you need to find the source. And so there are lots of different sources out there for seeds and plants. But for seeds, we mainly go online, although we can buy them from the store. But Baker Creek Heirloom, it's great for your heirloom seeds. It's Missouri-based. Johnny Seeds is more commercials. Then we have several that are more focused on seed saving and open pollinated. Those are Seed Saver Exchange and Seeds of Change. Then we have Burpees, Territorial. And this is just a taste. This is just a few of what is available out there. There's all sorts of seed sources out there. I was talking to someone the other day that went on Amazon and bought their seeds. So there's just lots of different ways of getting your seeds. And don't forget your local garden centers, nurseries, farm stores, hardware stores, any of the big box stores, they all have seeds also, but they also have transplants. So, just shop around, see what people have, try to figure out what varieties you want, because there may not be varieties locally. You may have to order them online. So always try to go with a reputable source. Try to get seeds that are guaranteed. There's all sorts of different terminology: organic, treated seeds. There's pelleted seeds. So, you know, there's just a lot of different options out there. So just shop around. And like I said, these aren't the only sources that you can get seeds from, lots of different places. Okay, so let's talk about the time that you have to invest in that garden. In a 1,000 square feet garden, which is roughly 25 by 42, it's going to feed a family of 4, and that's canning, freezing, and fresh eating. This garden will require about a half an hour of work a day. Now, this is on average. So there may be days you go out and spend 2 hours, and there may be 2 or 3 days you don't spend any time. So this is on average a half an hour of work a day to obtain maximum production. And so this is going to be going out there, scouting the garden. It's going to be hoeing. It's going to be watering. It's going to be, you know, tying your tomatoes up or caging them. You know, all sorts of different things that go into that half an hour of work. And so, like I said, half hour on average. This is what a garden roughly might look like that would be 1,000 square feet. And so I just want to spend a few minutes to talk about it. I tried to base this on the vegetable gardening calendar. So for example, 16 tomatoes, it says that you can do freezing and fresh eating and canning for a family of 4. And then of course 2 rows of bush beans, probably, you know, maybe 20 foot rows of green beans. Then we have onions and green onions. So if you're going to have storage onions, usually we try, they are the bulbs, the little bulbs you can buy. If it's green onions, you're buying the slips, but the slips can also lead to storage onions. And so I always like to mix and match my onions. And then of course in the same row, I always try to keep the radishes, carrots, and spinach, and cabbage and broccoli, lettuce and beets, any of the cool season. And that way, later in the season, I can come back and put some type of warm season crop, such as summer or winter squash. And then of course we have 2 rows of potatoes. Then we have a second planting of lettuce. And then of course corn, we want a blocker corn. Instead of having 2 real long rows of corn, we want to try to have 4 shorter rows of corn. Any type of vining cucumber we want to have on a trellis. So I always have a bent over cattle panel that's attached to stakes, and then my cucumbers can grow on that. And then of course I may have smaller cages for my pickling cucumbers. And then this is just basically an all-around type of garden. And so I always try to tell people, always put that list of plants that you want to plant down the side, and then start arranging them. Now you always want to separate families. And so tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, and potatoes are all in the same family. So if you've noticed, they're all separated. And those are ones that really share a lot of the diseases. Then of course, then we have the cole crops. Now I do have a habit of planting my cabbage and broccoli together. I've never ran into bad disease problems, but I always have cabbage loopers, but it's easy enough to control. That leads me to the subject of crop rotation. And we want to try to rotate where we put a plant every 3 years. So back on this other slide, my tomatoes would be on the left-hand side this year. Next year, they better be on the right-hand side of the graph. And then, of course, the 3rd year, I would have them in the middle. And then 4th year, I would have them back on the left in its original spot. And so tomatoes are the big one that we really push to rotate, because it takes 2 to 3 years for the disease spores to die or start to die out of the soil. So to try to lessen the disease pressure, that's what this rotation is for. And so if you'll notice on these graphs, the tomatoes are always in a different spot. The pumpkins are always in a different spot. So we rotate where we put everything. And so that's why drawing the garden out is important, so that you can keep that rotation continuously going. And so you're never putting anything in the same spot. And so that's going to help with disease and insect issues. Okay, so let's talk about, all right, let's talk about sowing seed. Just remember, you know, you have your seed, you're ready to plant. So if you don't have any guide on how to bury those seeds, let's say you didn't have the vegetable calendar, you didn't have the seed packet, the rule of thumb is you plant that seed 2 to 3 times their width. And so on the smaller seeds, such as turnips or radishes, lettuce, you're going to go 1/4 inch deep. So the bigger seeds, such maybe the smaller cucumbers or okra, anything like that, you're going to be planting a little deeper to the 1/2 inch. Now, our garden calendar is really good about telling you the depth, and so is the seed packets. It is important to pay attention to the seed depth, because if you get those seeds too deep, they won't have the energy to make it up out of the ground. If the seed is planted too shallow, then the roots won't establish deep enough into the ground to keep the plant standing up if we have heavy rain or if we have wind. And so we need to be really cautious about how deep we're truly planting them. Then if we plant them too thick, then competition happens. So they're competing for light, they're competing for nutrients, they're competing for water. And so a lot of times if you plant them too thick, you won't ever get radishes that grow under the ground. You won't ever get carrots. The lettuce will only ever get 1.5 inches tall, and it'll just stall out. And so it's very important to go in there and thin. And so the smaller things need to be thinned to about 1 inch to 2 inches apart. And then the larger ones probably 4 to 6 inches apart. And I think I have some information later on that. There are ways to plant seeds, and I was just going to run down through those. One is broadcast, and that all you're doing is throwing the seed out and scattering it over a square footage area. And so there's no rhyme or reason where that seed is laying. And a lot of times this is where you have, once it comes up, you have to go back and thin, because you may have seedlings too close. You may have seedlings that are too far away. And so you might have to go out there and thin. Then we have line sowing. And line sowing is basically where you're just sowing in a line. The top diagram is where they've put 2 stakes in. They've stretched a string, and then all they're doing is going through and putting seeds in a line. The next one is dibbling, and that's where all they're doing is making little holes and then coming back and dropping the seeds. And then we have hilling. Hilling is when we go to a spot, a circular spot, and we push the soil up about 2 to 3 inches above the soil. So we make a little hill, and then we drop seeds in that hill and plant them. And the hill is supposed to increase the heat or keep the seeds warmer so that they sprout a little faster. Then we have using a seeding device, and I'll talk about that here in a minute, or a planter. And then, of course, transplanting, blocking, and that is when we take a small square area and we're making several rows in that small block area. So in that small block area, you may have 5, 6, 7 rows of lettuce or radishes or spinach. So you're blocking it instead of planting it in long rows. And then, of course, square foot gardening. So, so the top one we talked about, it's the line spacing. Second one is broadcasting. The third one is planting in hills. And then the third one is the square foot gardening. And I had showed you pictures earlier of that. And all you're doing is just basically using, the square foot for 1 to 6 to 18 plants. I really like using planting aids. One that I like to talk about is the notched board. And this is where you can just take a 1x6 or a 1x4 even, and you're notching it like every 6 inches or every 12 inches. And then when you go out to the garden, when you go to transplant or you go to seed, that you can drop it at certain notches and either be 6 to 12 inches apart. The other way is to have a string with knots. And once again, it gives you a guide of where to drop that seed. The third picture in the middle is that dibble board. And basically you're taking a board, shoving it down in the soil. It makes little indentions, and you know where to drop your seeds. So pretty simple. The one on the left is the planter that I like to use. It's got a little, it has little discs for the different size seeds. And so you set the disc, you set the depth of the seed that the seed's supposed to go, and you can just fill the little chamber with the seed and run it down the rows, and it drops seed ever so many inches and so deep. And so it makes gardening so easy. I really love that. The other one on the right is just taking a simple PVC pipe. And this is for people that might have knee issues or hip issues. And all you're doing is taking that PVC pipe and you're putting it every 6 inches and dropping a seed. 6 inches, drop a seed. 6 inches, drop a seed. Or 12 inches or however many inches. And it takes that bending action out. I really like this tool too. And a lot of it's because it just takes, you know, it's easy. It's just easy. Let's talk about transplants now. Transplants can be great. One is earlier harvest. You know, we don't start seeds of tomatoes in the ground because we cannot make it to the end of the season and get enough tomatoes. So we start them earlier in the house, or we buy them from a garden center, and we can jump start that season just by 6 weeks by getting that plant in the ground. We have, you know, it makes it to where we might have better growing conditions, more time to prepare the soil, head start on weed control. You know, I've learned that I only till up the area of the garden that I'm going to use right then and there, because weeds will come up where you till. And so a lot of times if we can get tomatoes started indoors or anything else started indoors, we can really not till so early so we don't have seeds. And we get to avoid certain pests, such as cucumber beetles or squash bugs. You know, they are here pretty early, so if we can get a jump on that season and get transplants started in the greenhouse or in the house, you know, we can have produce off those plants before the pests really hit hard. And the other thing is the need for thinning is eliminated, which really helps. I hate to thin. I hate to destroy little seedlings. And then, of course, it provides the option for a second crop when you can get an earlier start in the garden. So just remember, if you are buying your plants from a greenhouse or you're growing them yourself, just remember those plants need to be hardened off. And so, you know, if you take them out and plant them out in full sun when it's starting to really get hot, those plants are going to yellow. They're going to have burnt lesions on their leaves. They may even die. So just remember, if you buy them from a greenhouse, you know, or a covered structure, make sure that, or even out of your house, make sure that they have that acclimation process. So you take them out, you might put them on the back porch for a few days, out under a shade tree for a few more days, and then finally end up planting it out in the garden. And then that way you don't run into problems. The other thing I like to do, and this is the lower picture, is I like my frost blankets and my, just the covers that go over plants. And they can shade too. So if you put something out in the garden, and they can provide some shading also, as well as guard from insect and cold weather. Best planting practices: avoid the heat and the peak sun when you're planting. Plant preferably in the evening after 4 or 5 on an overcast day. I always try to gauge mine before, you know, any bad weather's coming. If any bad weather's coming, I don't plant. I try to hold off to where they're calling for gentle rains. But try to get them in timely. You don't want to get them in too late. You don't want to try to get them in too early. With tomatoes, I've learned having mulching material ready to go is really key on disease prevention. So as soon as you get those tomatoes in the ground, have that straw ready to go and straw them in even before you water them, because those soil particles are where that disease lies. And so if you're watering without any protection around that plant, you're already, they're already getting exposed to those disease particles that might be there. And then have your trellising, staking, cages ready to go also. And the other thing that I always try to tell my husband is, let's give us a little more time this year. Let's not start at 6, let's start at 4. And so give yourself time to get it done, because it always ultimately takes more time to get this stuff in than you think it will. And so try to always give yourself enough time. And do remember to water the plants in. It is very important. Here's the common spacing for all the plants: 2 inches apart on peas and radishes, 3 inches apart on the plants that are a little bit bigger than that. And as you can see, that the spacing really is based on how big the plants are going to get. So just keep that in mind. On my tomatoes, I have learned that really 4 and 5 inches, 4 and 5 foot apart is sometimes the best, especially if we've got a rainy, crazy year going. Another thing I want to point out is keep the seed packets. They have a lot of good information on them. There was one year I had a honeydew that I thought was I think it was an 85-day honeydew, and it ended up being a 110-day honeydew. And I had thrown away the packet, and I kept harvesting them and opening them and finding out that they weren't ripe. Couldn't figure out what was going on. It wasn't until I went back and looked at my purchase record that I figured out what variety it was. And then I realized, hey, you know, I was way off on those number of days that I was expecting a harvest. So keep the seed packets, because there's lots of good information on them. And I like to always remember from year to year what I grew. Water is essential in gardens. Just keep that in mind. When you're planning, plan for how you're going to water. Stoker hoses and drip emitters are the best. I try to avoid telling people to do any aerial or overhead irrigation, only because of disease problems. The big thing is also learn what dry looks like. You know, if you can't figure out if it's dry, dig around, feel the soil. And I know that sounds like a silly thing to suggest, but, you know, people go out all the time, think it's dry, and come to find out it's wet an inch underneath. So figure out what dry looks like. And then if you really have hard water or bad water, best thing you can do is harvest rainwater. Care after seedlings. Anytime I'm seeding, if they're small seeds, I'm going to have a light straw cover. And a lot of that has to do with soil compaction, soil crusting. And so if we get big rains after I seed, my seeds aren't going to come up because they can't push through that crust. So I have found out that light straw cover can really help with that. Always watering new transplants, check moisture regularly. Always remember that broadcast seed will need to be thinned. You want to always hill your tomatoes as they grow, and mulch where possible, even if it's a sheet of cardboard or newspaper. Just remember to block it down or mulch on top of it so it stays down. Side dress when plants are at appropriate size. So don't side dress until your tomatoes are, you know, blooming and corn at 18 inches. But once again, on that planting, make sure to plan for that, because they need that extra fertilizer. And label your plants if you're using multiple varieties in one crop. And the other big thing is begin scouting. Just take a stroll through that garden right after planting, every couple of days or even every day, because things can go bad in a hurry. And so if you can get, and the garden will be more of a success. And I'm really big about redefining your peak season, and that's through using high tunnels, low tunnels, hotbeds, you know, any of that stuff. You can really stretch that garden season if you really like your produce. Okay, some of the resources I used for putting this together. Other specialists, I have a map here in a minute of all the specialists across the state. We have a wonderful website that you can go and look at the different publications. That's the picture on the right of our website with gardening publications. There's a book online that I really like. It's Vegetable Gardening in the Midwest. You can still find it on Amazon and a few other places to buy, but for the most part, if it's online as a PDF, just download it. And then the other one is From Seed to Harvest and Beyond. That's the Garden Journal and Calendar. I think they run about $20 on the website, or you can get a hold of your local extension office and find out where the closest journals are, because there's several different places across the state that has them. And here, that wraps up my program for tonight. This is the map of all the different horticulture specialists we have for the state of Missouri.
All right, thanks very much, Donna. Debbie, do we have questions that we can look at?
Yes, we do. We have some questions here. Sorry, I couldn't find my unmute button because I was typing answers into the Q&A box. So there was one here, Donna, so I didn't hear exactly what you had commented on, but someone wanted to know, let me scroll back up here to find it, the green, when you had your tools listed up there in the pictures of it, there was a green seat that had some wheels on it. Where did you get that from?
I've seen it at several different places. Here in Southeast Missouri, Sam's had them, Walmart had them, Buckeyes, and I think Menards had them.
Okay, great, thank you. We've had a couple of questions come in about compost. If you're making your own compost, what really should be added to it? And do you know of any options that don't stink or less stink?
Okay, so you should be having a good mix of browns and greens for adequate breakdown. If you have a stinky compost pile, it's either because you have too many greens and you need more browns, or it could be that it's too wet and you need to add more browns. So you need to start gauging what is a brown and what is a green, and have more of a 1-to-1 ratio so that you get that breakdown and there's no stinky mess. And the other part of it is that you can turn that compost and help with that stink.
I would like to add there that next week we're going to talk about soil fertility, and Justin is going to talk more about compost and how to fertilize your vegetable garden.
So, Donna, what do you think of a hand tiller?
A hand tiller. Do you mean I'm assuming hand cultivator?
That was the question, so I'm not 100% sure, but I would talk about, go ahead and answer the question as you think it is.
So if it's a hand cultivator, I think any cultivation tool is good. I mean, I'm just trying to think of what a hand, yeah. As long as you're not overdoing it, I think that is always the good point about cultivation. Is some is good, don't overdo it. Yeah.
And I agree 100% with you on that. You want to try not to turn the soil over too much or dislodge it too much. We had a couple questions come in about soil testing, and so we answered those. But here's one in particular that I think you can add a little bit more. I looked up how to get a soil test on the Extension website. So always soil tests can go to your county extension office. There are lots of options that add more detail and more cost. What should I really be testing for?
Unless you have a really bad issue like plants just stunting, or they get chlorotic, or which means that they turn yellow, or they're washed out and they're turning different colors. I really think just a general regular soil test is good, because it's going to give your phosphorus, your potassium, calcium, magnesium. It's going to tell you how much nitrogen you need. I just really think that a regular soil test to start out is the wise decision.
Okay, and then someone put in the chat box that a hand tiller could be a garden weasel.
Yes, and I have one. I haven't used it in a long time, but I think theirs are great. Once again, I don't know that basically a garden weasel is trying to think of how basically it's a claw at the bottom and it's on a pole and you twist it. You stick it down and you twist it. And yes, I think they're good, but you can still overdo it. If you just get in there and you just, do it enough to break up the soil so you can get a good seed bed, that's what you want to do.
And we always get this question from every single year. There are a couple of questions about walnut trees. What can be planted near or should not be planted near walnut trees? And if we have a walnut tree that needs to be taken down, who's the best person that can do that for us?
So for sure, tomatoes do not respond well to walnut trees. I can tell you that for sure. I'm pretty sure that the beans you can still plant. I'd have to go back to the books to really tell you which ones can and can't. There are lots of guides out there. You can go to your favorite search engine, put in vegetable gardens and the word walnut and put the word extension behind it or edu behind it. And that way it only pulls up extension guides that are based on research based information. And so, and it will tell you which plants to put there that you can plant around walnuts and which ones you can't. As far as removing the tree, I don't know how to answer that one. You might get a hold of a certified arborist and see if it needs to be taken down. If you're going to take the tree down just because of the garden, just remember that the roots will still be alive for several years and will still affect the garden. So it might not be a wise decision to take that approach. It may be better to move the garden.
Okay, thank you. We've had a couple of questions talking about growing in a container, but really it's upside down. So for example, tomato plants and pepper plants, and I've seen them in the past where they have these different types of plastic containers and you put them in there and essentially they're growing upside down. What do you think about that and what recommendations would you provide?
I have not seen any benefit to growing them upside down. I mean, now if it's space and you want to hang them, I mean, and if it's just simple vertical gardening, then it can be done. But remember, a lot of the pots that they are putting those in are really almost too small for a tomato. You know, if it's smaller than a 5-gallon bucket, you know, like I said, the tomatoes don't grow that well. And so I don't know. I just haven't been too keen on the idea of upside down gardening.
And I'm not really too keen on it either. I've seen people try to do it. It hasn't been successful. And, you know, my thought process is that, you know, plants on purpose grow upwards instead of downwards. And I would think that they would be confused and would want to bend and turn. Before we go to the next question, I just want to remind folks that Juan put into the chat box that before you leave this evening and close the Zoom, or you need to put a little one to bed perhaps, we do have a short survey if you could fill that out. So it's in that chat box, so please look for that if you can. And then you do not need an appointment to have your soil tested. Most of the county extension offices are still, the building physically may be closed. Our offices are open in the sense that we are all working from home. So that's why Donna has up on the screen our email addresses so that you can contact us if you've got a question, or if you ask a question this evening and it wasn't answered. By all means, please email us so that we know, because in the question and answers we have just whatever your name might be. We don't have an email address, so we can't respond back to you if we don't get to it. So please send us an email, either Juan or Donna or myself, and we'd be happy to answer the questions for you. Another question is, what about companion planting in the vegetable garden?
Yeah, that's a whole nother topic. I think companion planting is good. It just depends on which type of companion planting, I guess. If you think that if you're planting marigolds to ward off insects, it's more likely that the marigolds are going to attract beneficial insects. There are a lot of plants that respond well to one another. I would get a hold of your local horticulturist and have that person send you some information on companion planting.
Right. There's a question about transplants. We're seeing a lot of transplants in the stores right now about lettuces, chards, turnips, some of carrots, some of those types of crops that we normally have seen planted by seed in the past, and now we're starting to see transplants for those. Do they really work as a transplant, or is it better to go ahead and put them in the ground as a seed?
I personally think it's better to go as a seed. I mean, I seen corn the other day in somebody's cart, and she had 2 6-packs, and I sort of chuckled, but then I had to step back and think, well, she's already got probably a 4 to 6 week jump on the on the season. So, I'm sort of torn on that because I don't know how well they transplant, honestly. Now, lettuce, it can transplant. Corn, I've heard can transplant, but I've never heard of carrots being transplanted or radishes.
And I've not tried any transplants. I've always planted by seed as well. Do we have a specific list of the different varieties of some of the vegetables that do well in Missouri specifically?
The vegetable gardening calendar has that information. It has the varieties that specifically do better in Missouri.
Great. And what about, go ahead.
And it can be found on the MU website, MU Extension website.
Great, thank you. What about, someone put in, what is a slip onion?
So a slip onion is one that has been growing in to where it's got the green part out. So you find them in bundles. So they're green, they have a green slip on them with a bulb on the bottom. And so what you do is they come in bundles of 25, so you can plant those slips in the ground, and you plant them about 6 inches apart. And so then you can, about 4 to 6 inches apart. And then after they're planted and they're growing well, you can harvest every other one for a green onion, and then let every other one develop into a bulb onion. And a lot of times the slips are a sweet onion instead of a storage onion. And so you have to use those really quick or get them in the refrigerator once you harvest them.
Great, thank you. Are there certain plants that absolutely should not be planted in the same dirt, for example, in the year that follows?
Tomatoes are the big one because they have early blight, and early blight will fall into the soil. And so if you would plant tomatoes in that same spot that next year, you would have a pretty bad disease problem come around.
All righty. I want to know what causes tomatoes plants to get brown spots and then yellow and die.
That is the early blight or septoria leaf spot. And both of them happen probably right around June, mid-June to late June. And they will start getting worse all season long. Now, I will tell you, if we have a very rainy season, it will be 10 times worse. If we have a droughty season, it tends not to be so bad. But it is, it's a disease that gets on the tomato and exists in the soil after that first planting year. And so if you can cover the soil, once that tomato plant is planted, you can help prevent it. So caging, don't water overhead, getting that ground covered. Those are very important things.
And we had a couple of questions, and I tried to answer some of them, but a lot of people were asking this. It looks cold towards the end of the week in St. Louis. They're calling actually for a frost Friday night and Saturday morning. I have already planted some of my warm season crops. What is the best way to protect from the cold?
Cover them. Don't use plastic, but cover them. Cover them with buckets or boxes, or you can do a cloth sheet. There are garden centers that sell frost blankets. You know, I'm a real big fan of the frost blankets. I think everybody should have them. But yeah, you can just use sheets. And the big thing is on when we have frost or freezing temperatures is try to get that stuff covered earlier in the evening, so then it locks in that ground heat and that plant stays a little bit warmer.
What is the best way to remove rocks when preparing a garden?
Bend over and pick them up. I think that's or take a rake and try to rake them out, because that's about the only thing I can think of.
Yeah,
Get the neighborhood kids and pay them $0.25 or a dime each.
I'm in Jefferson County, just south of St. Louis, and we have tons of rock here. So I know exactly what this individual is asking about. So what I've done is I've essentially have put in some raised beds and to eliminate the potential of having so many rocks. I literally cannot dig a hole to plant a tree or a bush in my area. So I built up instead of building down. I have a raised bed with broccoli, cauliflower in there now. Will I be able to put in green beans in time this year? I'm assuming it's, if this is what she has in her raised bed, will that be harvested in time to still grow green beans before summer comes to an end?
Yes, you have until August, probably the second week of August, to plant those green beans. And I would choose a green bean probably that has less than 70 days harvest interval.
All righty. Someone wanted to know about why does corn need to be planted in short rows?
Because pollination is important, and if you plant them in long rows, you don't have a good enough cross-pollination. You won't have full kernels, or you will have empty spaces where the kernels were supposed to be. And so blocking them will help cross-pollinate all the plants.
What is some herbs that you can leave outside and have them overwinter and come back, such as chives? And I have chives in my raised bed, and I actually take the flowers. They're blooming right now. And I take the flowers and I put the flowers on my salads. It looks pretty and they're edible. But what other herbs would you put outside that can overwinter?
Thyme, oregano, just depending on where you are, sometimes rosemary will and sometimes it won't. I always try to plant one outside, and I put one in a pot, and that way I have my rosemary. Then marjoram, parsley, sage.
Okay. For tomatoes, can we plant one in 1 square foot? I'd always thought that they needed to be 3 feet from one another. We're growing beefsteak, cherry, and Roma tomatoes this year.
I really think that 2 to 4 square feet per tomato. I mean, if it's a determinate like a Roma, you could probably get by with 1 square foot. But if it's indeterminate like some of those other varieties, I don't know. I would probably go with 2 to 4 square feet per tomato.
Okay, there were a lot of questions about container growing, and we do have Dr. Trinkline from campus will be joining us in June on container gardening and growing. We realize that that's a little late for those that are trying to start that right now. So Donna, I know you mentioned that 5-gallon buckets are not big enough for tomatoes. You need something a little bit larger than that. But what about some other vegetables that can grow in containers? One person asked specifically about sweet peppers. What size container should it be in? So let's kind of classify as small, medium, large containers and what might grow in them.
So small container might be like, let's say, a 2 or 3 gallon pot. A medium size would be more like a 5 to 6 gallon pot. And then a large container would probably be 10 gallons. And really, I mean, you can grow, I mean, with the exception of maybe corn, you can grow most anything in a container. And it goes back, take a look at the square foot gardening schematics or the designs, and you can sort of gauge what you can fit in a pot based on what you can plant in a square foot. And so I do the salad boxes all the time, and all it's about the same size as 2 square feet. And I do my radishes, my mini carrots, my lettuce, and my spinach. I get those large cattle mineral tubs from some of the cattle farmers, rinse them out real good and put holes in the bottom. And I mean, they're pretty good size. They have to be, what, 15, 20 gallons? If not, well, no, they have to be larger than that. And so you can fit a lot. You could put a tomato in the middle, put lettuce around the sides. You could put potatoes on one side and maybe lettuce and spinach on the other side. I mean, there's just a lot of combinations that you can do with containers. You can grow peas in them. You could grow green beans in them, zucchini. I mean, just anything. It just the bigger the plant is, the bigger the container needs to be.
Okay, great. This woman has a question about container gardening and having raised beds that are above ground simply because of limited mobility, so it has to kind of be raised up. Is there a difference in planting time-wise from planting in the ground versus being a container that's up higher and a raised bed that's up higher above the ground?
Anything that's above the ground is probably going to get a little warmer, especially the raised bed. You could get into the raised bed a lot faster, so you could plant sooner in a raised bed. And I'm talking about the cool season crops early on. With warm season crops, I still say May 1st is the limitation. Got to plant after May 1st. But in that container, if you're willing to put it on wheels, I mean, you could grow even in February, start stuff in February and wheel it in and out of the garage or your back patio. Or, I mean, there's just a lot of advantages to containers. I hope I'm answering that question right.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
So I'm going to make this the last question, and then we'll have Juan close us out. I've had a soil test done. It did not need any amendments according to the report, but everything I read says that to periodically fertilize the vegetable plants during the growing season. Do you recommend adding some in the bottom of the hole when you plant? Do you need to supplement while it's growing? What is the best recommendation?
So one thing, they will be talking about fertility next session, but I'll go ahead and answer this. So I'm not real keen on fertilizing at planting, and mainly because you don't want to give the plant the wrong message. A lot of times, for example, if you plant tomato or if you fertilize tomatoes at planting, you're going to have a tomato that's all foliage and no blooming and no fruit. And so a lot of the guides, a lot of the books will tell you at certain points you start fertilizing. Like with tomatoes, when they start blooming, you start fertilizing. On corn, when they get about 12 to 15 inches tall, you start fertilizing. So everything has a time for fertilization. If you have a soil test and it calls for no amendments, there's no reason to fertilize at planting time. But you come back mid-season and you side dress. And all side dress means is that you're scattering a nitrogen or a complete fertilizer between the rows towards the plants, avoiding getting it on the plants. And that feeds those plants mid-season.
Thank you, Donna. We appreciate it. And if by chance your question was not answered, just go ahead and look at the screen, grab one of our names, jot down our email address, and send an email to us, and we'll try to go ahead and get those questions answered for you.